QSO Today, episode 529, Jake Groenhof N0LX. This episode of QSO Today is listener-sponsored. Please become a listener sponsor monthly or annually by clicking on the sponsor banner on the show notes page or at the top of the QSOToday.com webpage. Welcome to the QSO Today podcast. I'm Eric Guth, amateur call sign 4Z1UG, where I demonstrate the diversity and relevance of the amateur radio hobby and its impact on society by interviewing ham radio operators, many of whom played vital roles in shaping our technology through the amateur radio hobby. And while many people might say, ham radio? Do people still do that? This podcast demonstrates through in-depth interviews just how amazing, diverse, and dynamic the amateur radio hobby continues to be. Just a reminder that the response to my amateur radio events calendar has been great. You can get to it from a banner link on the show notes page. This calendar is updated by you, and I hope it will be the most comprehensive amateur events calendar. Please use it and update it with your ham radio events. If you are new to the QSO Today podcast, please be sure to look at the QSOToday.com website, where we have over 500 interviews with amateur radio operators. From there, you can click on the links that take you to the QSO Today Academy. Our catalog contains over 500 videos on every ham radio subject, completely searchable. A couple of episodes back, I mentioned that I'd sold my IC7300 to a fellow Israeli ham and how much I missed it. Well, I purchased another at great expense and have been working FT8 to get a sense of the propagation from my QTH and how my all-band inverted V fed with ladder line and an automatic antenna tuner is at the bottom. Well, I'm blown away by the worldwide coverage that I have with the antenna and how well FT8 works with PSK Reporter to give me a visual map of my rig's coverage. Jake Groenhof N0LX discovered amateur radio in the 1960s thanks to his uncle's impressive home station and his father's interest in CB radio. Over the years, Jake turned his curiosity into a lifetime of experiments, from pedestrian-mobile DX with just 5 watts and an endfed antenna tethered to a balloon, to building saltwater antennas in PVC pipes, to flying pico balloons that circled the Earth 6 times. Along the way, he set records, designed clever portable gear, and inspired others to push the limits of what amateur radio can do. N0LX is my QSO Today. N0LX, this is Eric, 4Z1UG. Are you there, Jake?
I am, and hello, Eric. Good morning.
Good evening here. Jake, thanks for joining me on the QSO Today podcast. Let's start at the beginning of your ham radio story. When and how did it start for you?
Well, it did start back in the 60s. I had an uncle, Hank, who was W9IUO in Addison, Illinois. I did not have a lot of visits with him. We would see him maybe a couple times a year, the family did. But in his basement, he had the stereotypical, the tower in the backyard. He had this basement with a table set up, and he had a big black box with glowing tubes on the inside, which I'm sure was his big amplifier. And I remember sitting next to him just one time, and he said he was talking to someone on an aircraft carrier off the coast of Japan. And if you don't think that is not fascinating for a 10 or 12-year-old, that was pretty neat.
Well, I think anybody listening will say that those are the kinds of things that hook them.
Oh, yeah. And then again, it's a little vague to me as to how this started, but my dad came home one day with a CB radio, and that, you might have heard of 11-meter band, but and he set it up, and he had got, maybe because his brother, my Uncle Hank, got him interested in it. He had actually joined the 5 Waters Club, which I was told at the time was the largest CB radio club in the country. We had fox hunts and summer picnics and that. And I still, after 60 plus years, I still remember the call signs that we had, because back in those days, it was legitimate enough to have a license and call signs. Our first one was 18A 9961, and then the FCC sent us a letter and said it was being modified to 18QA 0223, and then eventually KHA 3064. Now, what did I have for dinner a week ago? I'm not sure, but I did those calls.
Were you active on CB radio? as a kid?
No, it was kind of our dad's thing, but we had QSL cards plastered all around. It was in the corner of the kitchen, and I remember QSL cards from as far away as Villa Park, which was a suburb about maybe 15 miles away. But so we did the whole thing. We did the QSL cards, but what the first activity that I can recall was we had probably for Christmas had received some 3-channel walkie-talkies. And my brothers and sisters and I would use these and go around the neighborhood and see how far we could get. But one time we were using them, and a Whiskey 5 call came in, and he claimed to be a trucker in Texas. And so that was my first experience with what people call skip, I suppose. But the other thing that back in Chicago is I had a little 7-transistor shirt pocket radio with the 9-volt or the 9-volt batteries, and listening to it one night in bed when I was supposed to be asleep. And I received KAAY in Little Rock, Arkansas, which I had to look it up recently, and it was 550 miles away. So that was my first DX besides the Texan. And so all these things, like you said, it was like little pieces of a puzzle that was slowly, making me realize that I had a big interest in really radio wave propagation and how a signal can get from, hundreds and thousands of miles away. In 1974, I moved to Colorado with my wife. Been here ever since. And you know what? I have to mention though, if you need some filler stories, in Bensenville, in Des Plaines where we lived, sociologists came to the area. I didn't find this out until I moved to Colorado, and it was in our local Rocky Mountain News newspaper. Sociologists had gone to Bensenville to study a phenomenon that happens at all airports, but they chose my airport, O'Hare. And it's a phenomenon that I lived through as a kid every 60 seconds of my life. A plane was either taking off or landing, and these planes were about 300 feet over our head because we were right at the end of the busiest runway of the busiest airport in the world at the time. And what happens is you're standing around talking to your friends, and your subconscious hears this screaming 120 plus decibel jet screaming overhead, but you never really thought about it. And what you did is you just looked down at the ground and, kick the rocks or the dirt or something, because you knew you had about 10 seconds where you were not going to be able to hear each other. And as soon as your brain said, okay, it's quiet enough to be heard now, we continued on. Well, these sociologists actually titled it the Bensenville Hush. That was our claim to fame back there.
So the interest in radio didn't develop into a amateur radio license or a degree in electronic engineering. What did you do after high school? What kind of education did you seek? Or what kind of work did you pursue?
Well, I was working just on normal jobs, but I had an interest because I liked animals. I was actually taking pre-med courses to become a veterinarian, which I am not now a veterinarian, by the way. But so I did take a couple years before I moved to Colorado, because I graduated high school in 1971, moved out here in 74. But I did take a couple of years of classes and enjoyed the classroom setting and learning, just learning whatever it was to learn. I enjoyed that.
And what did you do for a living? What kind of career did you pursue?
Well, nothing in the 3 years after high school. The last job I had was working for a pool service company, and we would start. I was in the springtime of 71, and just before I moved here, and I would go out with the owner's son, which gave you a lot more privileges and a little less of the dirty work. But we did pool startups for some very interesting people. One was a football player, and I was not a big football fan, but he was with the Chicago Bears. We started up his pool. We started up the pool for Mr. Florsheim of Florsheim Shoes up in Half Day in Illinois. And the most interesting one was for, and you can edit this out if you want to, but the most interesting customer we had to go to in those 3-4 months that I worked for him was a known mobster, gangster, like the Godfather type stuff. And he was in the north central downtown Chicago, and he had one of the gravelly voice that you see in the movies. And when we were done with his pool, we're standing out in front of his open garage door. And he lived on a very nice neighborhood, as you can imagine, but the street curved a little bit. And he said, I'll try to reproduce his voice. He goes, yeah, you see that White House down there? That's the chief of police. I bought him that house. At which time Joe, the son's owner, said, okay, guys, time to go.
So when you say a pool startup, that's the seasonal start of the year. So in the late spring or beginning of the summer, you get the pool ready for use?
Yeah, you pull the cover off and drain it and, clean it with muriatic acid, which was always very interesting. And then, filled it back up, and people had, fresh pools to start your summer with.
So you have a very interesting, we're looking on video here for people listening on the audio podcast, and I'm over your shoulder. I see a wooden tool crib, like your tool chest there. Is that inherited, or is that something you found someplace?
No, that was actually, there are reproductions that you can buy in the last 30 years or so. But that case contains one of my other 47 hobbies. I jokingly say that my wife tells people that she counted up all of my hobbies, because my interests are all over the place. And she said she counted up my hobbies once and she stopped at 47.
You have a nice assortment of parts, it looks like, maybe even some old radios. I see GMRS there. I see some, other stuff. The magazines and books I can't quite see, but it looks to me like you've got a nice library going there. And this is a nice man cave.
That was 2004 Radio Communication Radcom magazine. They put me on the cover of all things.
Right, and you're in a very small rowboat.
Yeah, that's my ship.
That's your ship. So if you're maritime mobile, that's where you are. Is in an 8-foot dinghy.
Yep.
Okay.
That oak case that you're talking about contains all my watercolor painting tools and paints and such. So I will say my current focus is ham radio, and other things have been put to the side. I built a couple of telescopes because I'm interested in astronomy. I would like to someday get into astrophotography. I think it would be fascinating to be able to, because you can go online and see professionally, captured images, but to be able to do it yourself, to be able to, capture image yourself, to be able to talk to someone on the radio where it does not require billions of dollars of infrastructure, just a piece of wire and a little battery operated radio. That's where I'm coming from. I like that idea.
When did you get your first license?
It was 1987. I was taking some local license prep classes. I think it was just a 1 or 2 weekend thing. And so I was 34 years old when I got my first license. I was KB0 APA, which some people said stood for American Psychiatric Association. And then my work allowed me to take some classes. We had a vice president that came in from Ball one time and gave us all a talk. And he said that we're very big on education, and we like to see our employees, advance with their education. And someone asked, what kind of classes will you pay for? Masters in business and things like that. And he said, if you can find a course on underwater basket weaving, we'll pay for it.
So they'll pay for just about anything. So what did you do with that opportunity?
I did get a 2-year an associate degree in electronics. And because I was already licensed as a technician in 1989 when I started the school, every lecture, every time something new in the class, I would think to myself, even if it was really complex, or if it was something that was just kind of interesting to me, or even wasn't, I would think in the back of my mind, how can I apply this to my ham radio hobby? And so that's how I not got through that. It was actually very fun. But the trouble is, I was working 12-hour shifts, working for Ball Corporation. I started Ball in 1976, and I just retired in 2019. So I spent 43 years with Ball Corporation. And but so they did allow me to go to school. I was working 12-hour shifts, and then I'd have to drive a half an hour up to the school. And then I'd spend 4 to 5 hours each night in class. That first semester, I was taking 15 credit hours, and it was very interesting having to do my school homework on every break at work during the daytime so that I could be ready for that next class. But during that education, I did also take a prep class for the general radio operator's license. So I did pass that, and I included a radar endorsement. Because at the time I did consider moving to the Pacific Northwest and possibly, working on ship radios. And so I decided to get the big license, which I have not, used. But anything that you can build on your education, I think can only help. You know what I mean?
And what were you doing in ham radio during that period of time?
Well, as a technician, I do recall doing some 10-meter phone work, nothing digital, and very little CW. It was back in the day, though, when 5 watt or 5 word per minute CW was required. So I did have that.
You did that. You had to learn the Morse code to pass the technician class. Did you operate repeaters, anything like that, as a technician?
I did some, Eric, but I tell you what, one thing I kind of regret is because if you could see where I live in Golden, Colorado, I have the front range of the Rocky Mountains to my west, and we are down in a valley about 1,000 feet below the tops of these mountains. And to our east, looking towards Denver, I have North and South Table Mountain, which are about 750 feet, and they're only a couple blocks from my house. So I'm in this valley that I can get very few, in fact, most of the time, no repeaters. Even though we have some right on Lookout Mountain right above us, they're just far enough back in that I can't even reach them. So I've never done other than 2-meter simplex. I did a lot of that. I would talk to some guys on the way to work and the way home. So I did a lot of simplex, but not a lot with repeaters.
When did ham radio start to change for you? If you look at your website, and I'll put that in the show notes page, you're doing a lot of interesting things. Pedestrian-mobile is one we should talk about. But when did you start, pursuing the other things that you're doing now?
I will say that in 2000, I decided that I really needed to upgrade because I wanted the HF privileges. So I got the books and I studied a week or so for the general. I passed my general. And then I did spend an entire 4 weeks just to make sure I was really ready for it. So 4 weeks later, I did pass my extra class. That, of course, opened up the world to me for ham radio. And what really changed for me, I had a mobile rig, an HF mobile rig in my car with 2 ham sticks, one for 17 meters and one for 20 meters on the back of this pickup truck. And one day I was heading down the hill from our house, heading into town, and I heard a guy who claimed he was rollerblading. He was a professor in Champaign-Urbana at Illinois, at the university. He was rollerblading around campus with a Yaesu FT817. And I'm thinking, if he's telling the truth, I've got to stop and talk to this guy. So I didn't complete my mission. I actually stopped and waited for an opening. I had to talk to this guy who was not only able to rollerblade, which I've never tried, but then he had a whip antenna and a dragging counterpoise behind him, and he was talking on 5 watts from Illinois. That led me to the HF PAC group. It's a group of people who do this kind of thing, portable work, a lot of what they call pedestrian-mobile and marine-mobile, and one guy was even skiing down a hill mobile. So again, so that led me to finding out more about them and joining the group. And it was started by Bonnie, KQ6XA in California. And really interesting group of people. There were several in Colorado that down in Monument, Colorado, the Pikes Peak Amateur Radio Club would have their annual meeting at a high school down there. And we would meet up and we would have our some of the guys were ex-military and they would have their 50 and 30 watt military man packs. And there I am with my FT817 pumping out a full brick of 5 watts.
Well, that sounds very good. So it was because you were involved in these groups that you actually started pursuing operations in pedestrian-mobile.
And in the October 2003 QST magazine, which I have since lost, it was great. A gentleman by the name of Lewis, I forget his last name or his call sign, but he had an article. He was from Argentina, and he had an article on how to shorten a dipole using loading coils. And back then, the program he had you use was, what do you call it? A command window. And so you just opened it up and you plugged in the frequency you wanted, the size of the antenna that you were going to shrink it down to, and where you wanted the coils to be, 50% either side or whatever. And it gave you the value in inductance that the coils had to be. So at the same time, I had bought myself a little shirt pocket LC meter, and I was able to take PVC pipe and some wire and wind it. And if it was too long, I just wrap off a couple until I had the right inductance. And that worked really well. But I must say, I skipped one very important part, though. These guys, all these guys were using, the 102-inch, CB whip or military whip antennas that you snap together. And they would all drag a counterpoise, for the other half of the antenna. And in my mind, I thought, that doesn't sound like the best way to do this. So that's when I found out about endfed half-wave antennas, which has been my mainstay now for 20 plus years, is one form or another of endfed half-waves. And so I'm thinking, well, on 17 meters, my antenna is going to have to be 27 feet long. And I'm not going to carry an MFJ 10-meter pole on the back of a backpack to make this work. So I thought, well, how else can you hold up a piece of wire that's 27 feet long, 26 feet long? And I thought, a balloon. So I went down to our Party America store and bought two in case one popped. And the next day I went out about 3 o'clock in the afternoon, and I had a fishing line that would be like a safety line between my backpack and the balloon. And then I ran my 28 gauge Teflon coated wire, and I took off. And I am now doing pedestrian-mobile with a 5-watt radio and a balloon hovering over my head. Well, if you can imagine the few people that I would meet on the trail, one time a lady and her little son were walking towards me, and he looked up at me and he said, "Hey, mister, is that your pet balloon?"
And now this mid-show break. The QSO Today project now has over 500 podcast episodes and hundreds of hours of virtual ham radio expo presentations, all freely available and fully supported by you, the listener. This short message and the later mention of the Ham Radio Workbench podcast are the only breaks in the program. QSO Today has no commercial sponsors, so no one influences the content or direction. This project exists solely to promote amateur radio and the people who make it thrive. Producing QSO Today is like a half-time job. Your support at any level covers the tools, hosting, and production costs that keep it going. And while it is a labor of love, it isn't free. Only about 6% of listeners contribute. Please consider making a donation. Use the slider on our donations page to set up the amount that reflects the value that you get from each episode or from our library of educational videos. Make it monthly to help secure the next 500 episodes. You can also become a listener sponsor, shop on Amazon using our referral link, share QSO Today with friends, subscribe to our mailing list and YouTube channel, and help spread the word. Every action is value for value. Keep QSO Today alive by taking action now. We return to our QSO. How do you walk on a trail with a balloon? Is it you're walking on a trail that has no trees over it, or?
Yeah, just north of
desert trails.
Yeah, and north of town here, north of Golden, there is some very open space. There's a couple of places with trees, and you actually have to pull the line down and then let it go again when you get past the trees. But one time I was talking to someone on 17 meters, and he was in Chicago back, my hometown, and he says, "Well, Jake, you just faded in that last go, so better say 73 to you." I looked up to check on the balloon, and the balloon was gone. I thought, oh, no. Well, a slight breeze had come up, and I turned around behind me, and parallel to my shoulder was my balloon, because the wind was keeping it at about shoulder height, about 5 or 6 feet off the ground. So I walked back in the direction of the balloon. It came right back up, and he says, "Oh, there you are. You're 5'7" again. What'd you do?"
Is the balloon now the go-to thing, or are you actually using a fishing line and the loading coils?
Well, so what happened then is that was before I learned about the loading a dipole. And since I was feeding the dipoles at the bottom, of course, it has to be a impedance matching unit. I said, in Colorado, we get just too much wind. This is just too hard to control this balloon. So I did a hybrid where I did a 20-foot fishing pole, and I ran the line up the fishing pole on the backpack, and then I still had another 6 or 7 feet of balloon. And even that was still kind of unmanageable. So that's when I found out about the loading the dipole, and that revolutionized everything. So my main go-to then for pedestrian mobile was always a 20-foot Cabela's crappie pole affixed to my backpack and 2 loading coils in the appropriate place. The tuner, the matching unit that I used it's German. It's Fuchs, Fuchs, I guess they call it.
Mm-hmm.
And so a little over the shoulder, adjust it. And I would tune it initially by just, the sound of the static, the background. And then I could get a fine tuning with the little SWR meter that was on the 817. And I had just great success with that. I worked Japan, Argentina, Australia on 5 watts, just mountaintopping over here and close to my home.
Just so I understand this, is there some kind of routine with pedestrian mobile, or is it you just like to walk in the nature near your house and talk on the radio? I mean, do you have some goals in mind? Worked all states, DXCC, or how are you approaching your pedestrian mobile activity?
Believe it or not, Eric, just for the fun of it. I never worried about worked all states or all counties or DXCC. I have worked a lot of countries. I've worked a lot of states, but it was never a concern to me to collect paper, as they say. But what I did, the one advantage that I had was that with this HF PAC group, they had a online presence, and I could go in, 3:00 in the afternoon before I left and say, hey, by 2300 Zulu, I'll be on the air, pedestrian mobile. And so that alerted the, hundreds of hams, but also there would be the hams, especially in Japan. There were always 3 or 4 hams in Japan. JH10CC comes to mind, and several others who would be waiting for us. And so one time I was on the mountaintop and I was talking to Argentina, and as soon as I said my 73 to him, that JH10CC came right back. He'd been sitting reading the mail and was ready to talk to me. So again, it's still to this day, it fascinates me, Eric, that 5 watts, which, it was self-imposed. I could have used a more powerful radio. To this day, I could be running 100 watts. I do not own an amplifier. But for me, it is a challenge. What can you do with a little pipsqueak signal and still make it work, nice for you? So I do enjoy the QRP aspect of it.
It doesn't violate any HOA, for example, because you're not necessarily working from home. You do have an unusual antenna. I saw this as I was looking through your website. You have an ionic liquid antenna. Could you talk a little bit about what an ionic liquid antenna is?
I can. As you may know from looking me up, that I can talk a little bit about a lot of different subjects, but the saltwater antennas, the ionic liquid antenna, was the brainchild of David N0LX in Green Bay, Wisconsin. He started a Yahoo group back when Yahoo was the place to hang out with interest groups, and his group would try using, the typical bed springs and gutters and things like that. What can you load up that's conductive that will transmit your signal? So it was it was the quirkiness, but also the experimenting, the love of trying something new like that and experimenting. So the story that he told was that he looked all over for an RF engineer who could explain to him why with 50 watts in a PVC tube of salt water, he was able to reach other continents. And he finally found a guy in Great Britain who would talk to him over the phone, and he explained to the engineer what he was doing. And he said, no, that would be impossible. That should not transmit because you have sodium and chlorine ions floating in the solution. And he says, well, no, that shouldn't work. And that's when he said, well, I've worked, Australia from Wisconsin. And all he could say is, I'll be darned. So Of course, I hear about that, and I think that sounds too cool. It's so unique. I've got to try it. I made several different versions of it, including one that had a capacitance head on it for 40 meters. These are all 10-foot PVC pipes. Anything more than that, it becomes very unwieldy with the and this. I say salt water. I started out with sodium chloride, regular table salt, and what I had to do, much to my wife's dismay, is I would take our big enamel turkey roaster pot with the lid on it, and I would boil gallons of water. And for every gallon of water, you have to add 1.5 pounds of salt. So it actually becomes a super saturated solution. It took hours for that stuff to cool down. And sometimes I'd open the lid and it would bubble over. And of course, we'd have big piles of salt all over the kitchen. But my wife is very tolerant, which is one of the keys to being a ham radio operator, is find someone who is very tolerant of your quirkiness. But so anyway, that worked very well. And then one day I was doing the pedestrian-mobile up north of us again on that open field, and I heard N9ZRT. And I said, I've got to talk to Dave, right? Well, he wasn't using a saltwater antenna. He was not using a bed springs. He had gone, this was just before Christmas, he had gone to the tree farm and found a scrawny Charlie Brown Christmas tree, probably, 6-7 foot tall. And he cut off the bottom, soaked it in salt water for 3 days, and then put his transmitter up into it with his tuner. And I was talking pedestrian-mobile to Christmas tree portable.
You actually built this antenna with all of this salt water, super saturated solution salt water, put it in this 10-foot PVC pipe, and what happened?
Well, the first one I hung up in a tree just in front of our house, and I thought, well, I don't have any ground or anything, so I took a tent stake and drove it in the ground, and I took the alligator test leads, and I connected it to the bolt that I had inside the PVC pipe for the antenna, and the ground was just about a foot long test lead going down to that stake in the ground. And next thing you know, again, 5 watts. And I always told myself, I'm just going to see if I can use my MFJ antenna analyzer and just see if I can get it to tune right with a tuner. Well, it tuned so well, I said, all right, I've got to go inside and get my radio. So the next thing I know, I'm talking to people on the East Coast from a 10-foot PVC tube of salt water.
And with no ground radios and anything like that, just a tent stake in the ground.
Yep.
Well, that's pretty amazing.
Now, later on, I, because in Colorado, as you probably know, we can get very cold temperatures. And I found some documentation that was saying that salt water would be liquid up to about -4 degrees Fahrenheit. And I said, well, we get a lot colder than that, and winter's coming. And so I looked into it, and calcium chloride is good to around 26 degrees below. So where do you get calcium chloride, right? Well, at the Walmarts and places like that, they were selling a stuff called Prestone Driveway Heat, and it is pure calcium chloride. So once again, I am boiling water over my stove and making a mess, but that worked at least as well.
So you pour the calcium chloride into the hot water, and how do you know what the solution is?
Well, I used the same solution as before with the salt, with the sodium chloride. I saw that about 1.5 pounds was the most I could per gallon was the most I could put into the water without it then coming out of solution when it cooled. So it made for very heavy water. I think it was 9.5 pounds or 10 pounds per gallon instead of 8.3 that regular water is. But again, is it highly efficient and everyone should run out to the hardware store and get some PVC tubing and boil some water? No, but it's again unique and just another way to communicate. And besides that, even if you're shy and don't know what to say on ham radio, if you tell somebody you're in a rowboat in Colorado, or I'm talking into a tube of salt water, you will definitely have something to talk about.
Now, you sent me a picture of you and your 8-foot maritime mobile up at 13,000 feet. Can you talk a little bit about that? And to your knowledge, is that the highest maritime mobile ham radio operation?
Before I did that, yes, I did scour the internet, and I figured I would see somebody who was in the military in Nepal somewhere, and for some reason they are doing, high altitude exercises with a rubber inflatable raft at 20,000 feet or something on the side of Mount Everest. I could not find anyone claiming a higher altitude, and the highest water that I could find was this little. It's a man-made reservoir. It was on top of Mount Evans at, like you say, 13,800 feet, but the summit of Mount Evans is over 14,000 feet. And it was the water supply for not only a restaurant that used to be up there, but also for there's a university research lab up there too for high altitude stuff. And so, it was a small pond, but I said, well, it's water and I'm in a boat. And I thought, why not? Why not try to set the world record? So I did have two hams, two friends of mine who came with me kind of as witness and to help me drag the boat across the rocks down off the little road that goes up there. And the funny story is when I got back, they said, yeah, of course you get a lot of questions. There's a guy, 100 yards off the road down this embankment in this little lake, and he's got an 8-foot rowboat and a 20-foot fishing pole off the back. And they said, people asked, well, what is he fishing for up here? And they told him, marlin. And he said that usually satisfied their curiosity.
Uh-huh. Wow. Well, that's pretty amazing. Okay, so you've set the record with your maritime mobile. Is there a group of operators that pursue, I guess it's Lakes on the Air, right? Is that still a program? And I guess you could find lakes in every state. So is that anything that you're pursuing?
Well, I don't know about that, but I do know that there is, IOTA, Islands on the Air,
right,
is an international organization. And as I understand it, those are predominantly or all have to be saltwater. They have to be, in the ocean somewhere, as I understand it. Well, someone decided back turn of the century, I guess, to start a group called U.S. Islands Awards Program. So it's U.S. Islands. And it can be any freshwater. There's some restrictions. The island that you activate does have to be 100 feet offshore and at least 50 feet long. So I rigged up one of those extension winder uppers, for power. And I had a big piece of rope that had a knot at 50 foot, and then it was 100 feet long, and I tied a tennis ball to it. So when I went out to check out a lake, I could fling this thing over, and if it didn't touch, I knew it was at least 100 feet offshore. So, and I did wind up activating 3 islands here in Colorado. One was just north of Denver by about an hour, but 2 of them were up at 9,000 feet on Lake Dillon. It's a reservoir up in the mountains. And, so a friend of mine and I were scouting this out, and we found, the access road so I could get as close to the island as possible because, as you may know, weather in the mountains, especially around noontime, can change instantly to thunderstorms when it was clear blue skies. So I found a place. It was a access road to the backside of Dillon that would give me about a 5-minute row in my boat out to the island, to the first island, and then another 5 or 10 minutes to the next island. So this was September of 2001. And as you may recall, on the 11th, a tragic event happened. Well, unbeknownst to me, a week and a half later, I get up there, and it turns out that they had closed that access road because of national security, because it's a dam that if somebody blew up the dam, it would flood Denver or whatever. And so I had no access to it. The only access was clear on the other side of the lake, about 1.5 miles across. I was not planning on that. So that morning I woke up and I drove over there. There was actually frost on the bottom of the boat. It was upside down in my pickup truck. I get to the lake, I put in, and I got successfully. There was that low fog that you can only see, maybe 100 feet in front of you. And so I get out to the first island. I worked it. I went to the next island, got that. But then about 11:30, I saw the whitecaps were starting to form and the waves. And here, this little 8-foot rowboat, and I have 1.5 miles to get back to the shore. So I closed out that operation, having activated it, and rowed back. Well, on the way back, it was, I don't know, maybe a 25, 30 knot wind had come up across the lake, and I had to row with 2 pulls on one arm and only one on the other, just to keep the boat straight enough to maintain my course, but made it. And so I was able to activate those 2 other islands at 9,000 feet.
And now this mid-show break. Every 2 weeks, I listen to the Ham Radio Workbench podcast with George, KJ6VU, Vince, VE6LK, Mark, N6MTS, Thomas, K4SWL, Michael, VA3MW, and Rod, VA3ON, and their guest on often topical and important projects in amateur radio. This discussion amongst the regulars and their guests remind me of the conversations that I used to listen to on 146.94 and 146.46 megahertz in Orange County, California, while working on my own workbench almost 50 years ago. It is amazing how much practical ham radio knowledge that we can absorb by listening to the Workbench podcast that starts to make sense when we start our own deep dive into our own projects. So join me by listening to the Ham Radio Workbench podcast now and as George and crew push beyond 200 episodes. You can get to the Ham Radio Workbench podcast by clicking on the banner in this week's show notes page. And now, back to our QSO. It's my understanding that you've started to get into high-altitude ballooning. Can you talk a little bit about how that started and what you're doing there?
Okay, and that's my primary interest in ham radio right now. And hams have been doing high-altitude balloons for decades. There's a guy, Bill, WB8ELK, who is kind of the grandfather of ballooning with ham radio. He might be an interesting person to interview sometime.
I already have him. Yeah.
Oh, you did? Oh,
Sure.
do you? Okay, interesting. Well, so, the National Weather Service puts up balloons every day, radio sondes, where they go up and have the instruments and they get atmospheric pressure and winds and everything. Well, they use a latex balloon, as do a lot of the hams. And what latex does, of course, is like any party balloon, it'll stretch and stretch and stretch until it can't take it anymore, and then it bursts. And then the high altitude balloons that the Weather Service and hams use come down with a parachute. And because you've got this nice box of telemetry and computers and electronics, you want to have a chase team to go chase it some 50 or 60 miles downwind. Those balloons will go upwards of 90 to 110,000 feet. What I am interested in, however, is something called pico balloons. And it uses typically a clear mylar material. So it's basically a very thin plastic. And you fill it with, in our case, instead of using helium, we use hydrogen for a good reason. It's better lift. And believe it or not, everybody will say, well, hydrogen will leak out of the walls of the balloon faster. And it doesn't, because hydrogen, it always comes as a molecule of 2 atoms. And helium is a single atom. So actually the 2 atoms of hydrogen are actually bigger. And so you fill the balloon with a certain amount. And what you have to do is, I should maybe start with the payload. What are we doing with these balloons, right? And that is, we have a small Raspberry Pi Pico board that is the computer. And then soldered out to that is a RF board, which contains clock chip. So it's just the clock generating the frequency and some other circuitry, of course, and a GPS chip. And so in my case, I use, as the base for my payload, I have 6 very, very thin solar panels that are on top of of this board. And the board is actually a hamburger meat tray from the grocery store. It's that polystyrene, I think it is. And it's 7 inches by 2.5 inches. And you have to very carefully solder these 6 solar panels together, top and bottom, and then place them on there. And then the computer board and the RF board are placed underneath. And the entire payload, including the full-size dipole antenna, 34 feet long for 20 meters, The entire thing is about 13 grams, less than half of an ounce. And what it does is it transmits whisper, and you can select any band you want, but the most popular is 20 meters. And so you have this balloon, and you're filling it up just to the point of buoyancy. And so you know you're getting close, right? But what you need is, if it's just buoyant, it'll stay there and hover in front of you and never go anywhere. So what you do is you add just enough extra lift of the lifting gas, and it's called free lift. And typically around 5, 6, 7 grams of free lift, which sounds like nothing, because as I understand it, a paper clip weighs 1 gram. So we're adding the equivalent of like 6 paper clips more of lift. And you seal the balloon at the bottom, you carry it outside, and you hope, number one, you don't do this if you know it's going to be cloudy, and if it's going to be a very windy day, because it's not going to work. So you hope for very calm winds when you launch. You connect the antenna to the balloon, and as soon as that balloon goes straight up, you know it's calm, you let it go, and it will climb at a pretty good rate, maybe 200 feet a minute, 150 feet a minute. And you can watch it if it's very calm. We watched one of my launches for about 10 minutes straight up overhead at my friend Ted's house. N0LX, by the way, is my partner in crime with pico balloons. So this balloon is lifting up in the air, and as soon as the solar panels kick in, you can go inside and listen on your radio and watch for that first transmission, which is always a relief when you actually see it transmit for the first time. Because there's no batteries on these things, we couldn't, number one, they don't operate at 40 below zero, and number two, that would be way too much weight. So the entire transmitter and the GPS and everything works on solar power only. So when the sun is up around 18 or 20 degrees in the sky, it'll turn on. When it's setting about 18 or 20 degrees above the horizon, it turns off and goes into a deep sleep overnight. So this balloon will continue up, and after now 6 balloons, I have learned that it takes, at our altitude anyway, it takes around 3.5 to 4 hours consistently to get up to whatever its cruising altitude is going to be. That's determined by, like I say, you start out with very little lifting gas in here. It looks like a trash bag that's just got away from somebody. It's not round and full, right? But every 18,000 feet, it doubles in volume until it reaches that point where it's called super pressure. It's what they're called, the super pressure balloons. And it says, I can't expand anymore. So that's the altitude it's going to stay at. And if you've done everything right, that altitude is between 42 and 45,000 feet up in the stratosphere.
That happens to also be the cruising altitudes of most commercial jets, right?
Well, I think the lower, 38, 35, 40, 42,000, I think. But, so the question someone's going to think now is, well, what about the FAA? Don't they have restrictions on this? And they do. They have a document that they've put out that says, if your payload is under 4 pounds, we don't even want to hear about it. I mean, it basically even says that in the documentation. And your tether, your line holding your payload to your balloon, must be a carrying force of under 50 pounds. So we use a 6-pound fishing line, and we are a half of an ounce, not 4 pounds. And the way they determine 4 pounds of payload maximum is, as the story goes, they took a 4-pound frozen bird and put it into a static jet engine that was running at full speed, threw it into it, and it survived. So
the bird survived, or the engine survived?
Definitely the engine, yeah.
So how many of those launches have you done? And what are the results of those launches?
Well, I personally have launched 6. Now, like I say, N0LX, my friend Ted, lives up in Brighton, and for most of the launches, we're using his much larger property. Mine is what they call a postage stamp, so it's very hard to put up antennas here. But he's got a pretty nice field, and I personally have had 6 launches. Ted has had 8. On my first 3 balloons, the graph for my balloons would, because the telemetry that comes down through Whisper, we transmit the normal 2 minutes of Whisper, and that gives your call sign, your 4-digit grid square, and your power level. And then it transmits consecutively another 2 minutes, and that allows for encoding, I almost said encryption, but it allows for encoding of the telemetry, which is your altitude, speed, solar panel voltage, and temperature. So all of that comes in that second whisper transmission. So my first 3 balloons went up, in about 3.5 to 4 hours. You could see they plateaued. My first balloon lasted 1 10-minute transmission, and it started coming down just as pretty as it launched. So something happened with it, did not have a good enough seal or whatever. My second and third balloons also lasted just part of a day. They all reached altitude, they 42 to 44,000 feet, but they didn't make it. So on balloon number 4, we had tried some different things, and this one made it 4.25 times around the Earth. The quarter was off the coast of Portugal, and it was nighttime, so it went to sleep and never came back the next day. So we don't know if it lasted another 10 minutes or another 10 hours, but it never reported after that. The next 2 balloons, just coincidentally, made it exactly 6 laps around the Earth.
Amazing.
Plus or minus, a fraction of a degree, but their last transmission was due south of Brighton, Colorado, where we launched. And the first one was off the coast of Mexico. And the second one that just happened a couple months ago now stopped reporting at sunset over near Albuquerque, New Mexico, and just never came back again. But, 6 times, Eric, this still amazes me. Even though I've done this and I've seen all these balloon launches, to think that I go to bed at night and up in the stratosphere is this little toy balloon, 32-inch diameter balloon, up there by itself, transmitting when it can, going to sleep when it can, and it's surviving storms and wind shifts and the severe temperature changes and everything else. And it just keeps going the last one lasted 77 days.
Oh, that's amazing. You've become quite successful at these pico balloons, and this payload is one that you're making yourself?
Yeah.
Because I know that there are a number of people, even I think Bill was selling a payload kit, a circuit board that had, the solar power and the GPS and all that stuff on it. So, and I know QRP Labs also has pico balloon telemetry boards for those folks that don't want to build it themselves. This is really great. And are you involving perhaps the club or children's groups or something like that with your pico balloon launches and allowing them to track them?
There are some ham clubs that have gone to schools, under the STEM program and launched at elementary and even high schools. With those, of course, you cannot use hydrogen. You can't bring a flammable hydrogen into the school. So you do have to use helium, but that has been done. Now, my first experience of watching a pico balloon was a year ago, field day, and the Denver Radio Club was going to have someone launching a pico balloon. And here, Ted and I are getting ready. We've got the parts and everything. And I said, I've got to go watch somebody doing it who knows what they're doing. And so we got to see that one launch. And a couple of weeks later, we were launching our own balloons. But I would like to think that maybe if it catches on more with the Denver Radio Club, perhaps, that people who have contacts with education systems might be able to get us involved with schools, because this is something that if it's elementary school, if it's junior high, if it's high school kids, not only can they, learn the process, they can track it online, because these balloons, they go to Whisper, and then someone takes that Whisper data and makes their own server. They allow you to track it on an overlay on a map, plus graphs and charts to show the altitude and the temperature and everything. And so the high schoolers can do that, but then you can also go to NOAA, NOAA Weather, and they have a supercomputer. It's called HySplit, HY, and then the word split. And it was designed to track air pollution and things like that. And I think they used it for Fukushima when it released the toxic gas, the radioactive gases. And they were able to then track these floating particles. They knew the altitude. They knew, its location. And so what HySplit allows you to do is plug in your lat long and your altitude, and it will give you up to a 10-day prediction of where they're expecting your balloon to go. And the nice thing too is people say, well, what is the scientific or, human purpose for doing balloons like this? And it turns out that NOAA will actually take our data, and when they say that, okay, it should be over Uzbekistan, and instead it's over Tibet, what's wrong with and they're adjusting their algorithm for this program. So it does get used for scientific purposes also.
Well, that's very exciting. What do you think that we could be doing better to attract hams to the hobby? It seems to me that you're doing all the right things. You're actually quite public. What could we be doing better to attract people into the hobby that aren't already there?
Well, I think, reaching the kids, to keep the hobby going with new hams, I think reaching kids one way or another, school talks or whatever. I've given some talks to several ham radio clubs, one of which the Boulder Amateur Radio Club up in Boulder, Colorado. I gave a talk years ago to their Bark Junior. So it was the kids side of it. So you had to be there, Eric. I was setting up my Kodak carousel projector. This was about 2005 or 6. And they're all looking at it. And they're going, what is that? I said, well, it's a projector. They were more fascinated with my antique projector than they were my talk. But I was able to tell them at that time about my boating adventures and my pedestrian-mobile. So they thought it was pretty fascinating. So just giving them little pieces of experience, like what happened to me in Chicago. An uncle here and this and that, little things happen. And hopefully they will, become the future of ham radio.
What do you think is going to be your next ham radio interest? Is there something that's kind of cooking in the background now that, as you've done pedestrian mobile, you've done bicycle mobile, I see. You've done maritime mobile in your 8-foot dinghy. What's out there in ham radio that you'd like to pursue that you're not pursuing now?
Well, I am now the proud owner of a tiny spectrum analyzer, which will allow me now to take readings and as I build antennas. So it's new and it's not new, but I have 2 gain antennas, portable gain antennas that I am in the process of building. One is a bobtail curtain and one is a POTA performer, which has become a very popular portable for people doing POTA. All it is a quarter wave antenna with raised verticals, and you can turn those verticals 90 degrees and get a little bit of gain. So what I'm doing now is building a 5% larger reflector and doing the same thing with the radials. And with my new spectrum analyzer, I want to just see for myself. I can learn these programs, the antenna programs, but I want to be able to measure it for myself. It's that same thing where I want to see it for myself rather than just reading about it, right? So that's a little bit of what I'm interested in. The other thing is this last winter, I put out a log antenna, 290-foot log antenna on my little property. And log is loop on the ground. And I was interested in years past with VLF and medium frequency DXing. And so this winter, I was able to listen to 630 meter band down in the 474 megahertz range. In order to transmit, number one, no one's going to ever have a very efficient antenna for 630 meters. So you have to build big inductors and matching units. But typically, people will do a vertical as high as they can go and then an inverted L. So in my little postage stamp, I'm going to try, hopefully this winter, to put something up where I can put out something in a few milliwatts on 630 meter band. To do that, you actually have to contact a utility organization and get their blessing, because they don't want you within 1.1, I think, kilometers of a high power line where they actually send telemetry through. So, and they say the way you find out if you're qualified is if they never write you back. There's no paper that says you can do this. It's no, we don't tell you, so you're good to go. So I will be able to try 630 meters. Another thing I found that was really, to me, it's going to sound silly, but I was watching my balloons signal on the 20 meter whisper band. And so, it's a 200 kilohertz wide band you're looking at, or 200 hertz wide band. And off to the left, about 1 or 2 kilohertz on the waterfall, I saw this even, whisper is very narrow, 6 hertz wide, right? I saw this very thin signal coming through, and sometimes it would jog over to the left and then jog over to the right, but it was like going for like 5 or 10 minutes. And I'm going, well, that's not RFI. I wonder what that is. Well, it took many emails to different people, and somebody finally said, that's QRSS, which is extremely slow CW. And so that led me to QRP Labs, and I bought my first transmitter kit that I put together, the U3S, and I now have a Whisper and QRSS transmitter that I've done on different bands. But that's what it is you think that's just some weird, noise, but when it's got intelligence to it. So for me to send out my call sign N0LX takes 5 minutes.
Wow.
Just to say those 4 characters. So it's very slow. You can, I guess, have QSOs with a version of this, but I don't have the transceiver for that. But so those are some of the things, if I had the real estate and if I inherited some money, to me, it would be fascinating to do moon bounce. I've never seen anyone do it. I've never even been present, when someone was doing it. But to be able to be walking down the street with somebody and look up at the moon and say, I bounce my signal off the moon. Now, to me, that's cool stuff, don't you think?
Oh, I think especially if you could do it pedestrian-mobile. That would be really something.
Yeah.
What advice would you give to new returning hams to the hobby? Obviously, you're doing some unusual and unique things, but these are also things that a new ham could easily, with a little bit of mentoring, get into. What advice would you give a new returning ham?
Well, I'm glad you add the returning ham, because to new hams, I would say now with the internet, there are so many. Groups.io hosts quite a few ham-related interest groups, and I'm sure there's many others too. But I would say, since everyone new has the access to the internet, find groups online to start with. Also, take a look through ARRL and find out the ham radio groups in your area and see if some are more technically minded or some are more interested in the emergency services, if that strikes your interest. So whatever you're interested in, delve into it online. YouTube videos. I mean, I have to admit, I live on YouTube these days, and it's I don't watch any, cat videos or anything like that. It's all, to my wife's dismay, CW, learning, mastering CW or something about how to build a certain antenna. I usually try to do that when my wife falls asleep, and so yeah. But I think the one takeaway, if somebody does nothing else but hears this, Eric, is if you get into the hobby and say you're a technician or you get up to general class or whatever, and let's say for life events happen, your job makes you transfer, or you raising kids or whatever, and you just don't have the time, you maybe even lose interest in it for a while. My one piece of advice that I think would be really important is don't let your license lapse. Even if you think after 10 years or 15 years, probably never going to get into that, keep it up for the few dollars that it costs for the license. Keep it up, because all of a sudden one day you'll go, oh man, I've got to try that. And you're already there with whatever level of license you started with.
I think that's the first time anyone has ever said, don't let your license lapse, as advice to new returning hams. But I think that's very good advice. And I think I'll do it myself. I think I have to renew my American license this year, or actually this month. Jake, this has been a pleasure. Thank you so much for joining me on the QSO Today podcast.
Well, thank you, Eric. It's been a pleasure. And I was surprised that out of 2.5 million hams around the world, that somehow you found me. So I appreciate the opportunity. And as you can see, I have stories to tell, and may hopefully the enthusiasm will, maybe inspire other people too.
That concludes this episode of QSO Today. I hope that you enjoyed this QSO with Jake. Please be sure to check out the show notes that include links and information about the topics that we discussed. Go to www.qsotoday.com and put in N0LX in the search box at the top of the page. You can sponsor the transcription of this episode or any of the previous episodes by clicking on the transcription button on every show notes page. The cost is $75 per episode, regardless of the length. We will quickly transcribe the episode and give you credit for your sponsorship. Please send us the call sign of the podcast to make sure that we transcribe what you want. Remember that QSO Today is value for value. Please support our project by making a donation or becoming a listener sponsor today. Use our Amazon link before shopping at Amazon, as we receive a small commission on your Amazon purchases. Subscribe to our mailing lists, both my blog and the podcast, and forward the messages to friends and family who would enjoy QSO Today content. Promote us on social media and give us a 5-star rating and reviews whenever you are asked. QSO Today is available on every podcast player and venue, including Apple Podcasts, YouTube, Spotify, and Podcasting 2.0. Get a Podcasting 2.0 player to make it easy to get your next episode as soon as we publish. My thanks to Ben Bresky, who, as the consummate artist, makes this host and his guests always sound brilliant. Ben also publishes a weekly Jewish history podcast. There is a link to that on the QSO Today homepage. Until next time, this is Eric for Z1UG 73. The QSO Today podcast is a product of KEG Media Inc., who is solely responsible for its content.